Hey guys, so today Omar from Homar's Catalog had a really good conversation with Prospero AI, who has some hesitations about Tesla stock. He quoted that Elon could be removed as CEO, BYD as a threat. Is Elon attention too divided? There's a lot of backlash going against Tesla. So Omar takes these concerns head on, and if you don't know who Omar is, this is a guy who sat at a table with Elon Musk. He's a guy who's worked in software, he understands Tesla's technology really, really well. He tells a story about how he emailed Elon at 2:30 a.m. and a couple minutes later, Elon responds. And that's just one of the arguments he makes as to how much of a machine this guy is and how he's been divided his attention since the inception of Tesla. So it's a really good conversation. I think Omar is one of the most valuable people that the Tesla community has. I actually think he is the most valuable. And that's why I've taken this space that he posted on X. I've cut down the time by 20% by removing the silence, and I'm uploading it to YouTube for those of you who do not use X. So I hope you guys enjoy.
So welcome everyone. Prospero AI, great tool if you haven't checked it out. They just contacted me and wanted to have a little bit of a discussion about Tesla. Showed me some questions they had, and we're just gonna have a little bit of a bull bear discussion. So, do you want to open it up for us?
Yeah. I think I'll give a little background on even why I asked you to do this. So yeah, basically our app. We've invented some signals that I think help retail investors have an easier time interpreting, especially the options markets. And what I was seeing in our app was net option sentiment, which typically runs high for Tesla, and that's actually a short-term signal looking at the options markets, was much lower than it normally is. And upside, which is the long-term signal that actually integrates options, analyst ratings, price targets, price momentum factors, that actually had Tesla maxed out, which is strange because I think the way Tesla normally operates is people want short-term options because Elon Musk, kind of like Jensen Huang, is very, very good at constantly having things in the news cycle that drive up the price. So those short-term options, especially if you know the company well and are getting wind of that, are typically where we see people when they're bullish going there. So in looking into this more, what I typically do is I'll have interactions with people on X or Reddit or even Meta, and things were kind of so polarized. I couldn't really get good interaction points around what I was trying to research, stress test, and things like that. And so I knew Omar would be a really good person who obviously knows Tesla really well to kind of talk about some of the things that I wanted to investigate in terms of why maybe the long-term markets were a lot more optimistic in Tesla than the short-term ones. So a lot of what I sent him are kind of like long-term factors. And the only other thing I kind of want to mention is a philosophical one, and a little bit about my history. I started as a value investor about 20 years ago. I taught myself accounting to work at my first hedge fund. For the last 14 years, I've been in AI and actually have worked pretty hard, sacrificed a lot of money to build free signals to help retail investors. And kind of one of the big things I picked up on the way, and I think a lesson, that's good for anyone that wants to get better at investing, is to be able to challenge your own assumptions. Like I remember back when I was in the AMC trade, there were a lot of people that would like yell about FUD and not want to hear anything, even though I was bullish. Sometimes I wanted to talk about risk factors too. And I think it's super, super important, no matter where you stand on something, that you're able to, hear what people that might be, thinking a little differently, maybe doubting things that you aren't. If anything, if you can kind of take that in and you're still confident, you still have conviction, that is super important and actually kind of strengthens your belief in a stock. At least that's my perspective in how I try to combine, the signals that we built with kind of my own value investing perspective. And that's really what I'm trying to wrap my head around. I'm trying to figure out if I do want to go Tesla long in my high conviction portfolio, if there's good value there. And right now, I'm having trouble, grokking some things about the longer term picture of it that would give me security. So yeah, I want to learn a little bit more from Omar about how he thinks about these things with a higher level of familiarity.
Awesome. Yeah, that sounds like a great way to approach things, I think, in investing, and a little bit of a discussion is always fun. So, yeah, thanks for doing this. I'm excited to go over your questions.
All right. So do you want to kick it off with like the first one, or should I like is there like an order? I kind of just put them into that document.
Yeah, maybe you can just, sort of rehash it for the audience however you want, and we can dig in.
Yeah, maybe I'll kind of do like how I'm thinking about this from a high level in terms of what I view the primary risk factors, and then we can kind of maybe dive into them. So, one of them is, Elon Musk's attention, as he has, more and more stuff on his plate, and he kind of even admitted, that it was difficult, and that's something I've never really seen him do. Um, the second one is just around the PE ratio, which runs way higher than the Mag 7. And some of the sales, some of these sales relationships, sorry, some of these sales numbers that might start to, kind of put pressure on that PE ratio. Then, one is kind of more about China overall and how Tesla interacts with BYD and the long term takeaways from that, as well as how that interacts with the robotics portion. And then, I have something on insider transactions, and they're accelerating relative to the Mag 7. And then also just want to dig into full self-driving, the LiDAR versus camera approach, and if the public perception around Elon Musk might affect how that's received long term. So that's the high level thing. I'll just kind of like dive into the first one. And I guess my concerns, my high level concern with Elon here is that, for a long time, I've been a big believer in his. I shared something earlier, like our in 2023, we did, very well. I mean, we typically have beaten the market by about 50% or more each year, but 2023 Tesla was the driving stock. And I would say we believed in the valuation when a lot of people didn't, that had a lot more room to run. But since then, and one of the things I really respected about him was he always seemed to be in control. He had all these companies, he had this well laid plan. But, when I look at the backlash against him now, it's hard to say this is part of a well laid plan. Um, and I'm kind of concerned with this on two sides. The first side is, I read something about litigation, pension litigation around, kind of some of his divided attention, some of the things with public perception, that was coming out of New York. And so on one side, I'm kind of worried about him being removed because I think that would really affect the long term value of the company, if there's a lot of pressure from shareholders, lawsuits, that kind of thing. And then I'm just also wondering if, what your impression is of his divided attention, if that is kind of a factor in some of these, kind of potholes that the business is running into, and if you kind of see that changing over time.
Yeah, so that's a great place to start. I think really in terms of him getting removed, it's probably not something that I worry too much about. He has a pretty good control over the company despite, having a minority stake in the company. He's on the board, his brother's on the board. Most of the rest of the board is people who've been made very wealthy by him over time. And you look at the shareholder base, I mean, last year there was a vote on his compensation package, and 70% of the shareholders approved the vote, even though the goals of that package had already been delivered on. There was a lot of sort of anger at him for various things, and still you saw 70% of the shareholder base approve it. So I'm not too worried about him getting thrown out. He seems to have a pretty good hold over the company, and I think that's because of his track record in the past, what he's done. I mean, there's no doubt that over the past few years, his list of responsibilities has grown longer and longer. Starting in 2022 with the acquisition of X, him putting a lot more time into X, which is sort of a public facing company. Now his involvement in the government. There's a lot more sort of public facing stuff. But he's somebody who has never actually had CEO of Tesla as his full time job. He was the CEO of SpaceX. He'd started a rocket company. He thought, okay, maybe we can have someone else run Tesla. I'll provide some funding and, give him some guidance. And that didn't really work out. He had to kind of step in as the CEO of Tesla too. At first, it was, sort of a temporary arrangement. But then over time, the list of companies has gotten longer, companies like Neuralink, The Boring Company, etc. And most of those weren't really public facing. SpaceX is dealing with commercial customers. Neuralink is dealing with, the medical industry, not something your average consumer is going to face. But for as long as he's been running Tesla since the beginning, his attention has been divided among many companies. And, would we have done better with a full-time CEO compared to what Elon's done for the company? I'm not necessarily sure. So I think Elon, he has a formula across these companies, which is empower brilliant people, set a vision, figure out something that is almost impossible, but just on the boundaries of possible, and then empower brilliant engineers to do it. And take these engineers from companies where they're mired in bureaucracy, where they cannot get anything done because they've got to get approval from their manager and their manager's manager and their manager's manager, and put them in a place where the engineers are actually leading the company. And that's really why they like to work for him. And these kinds of people, when you hire really great people, they tend to not need a lot of micromanagement. You can kind of point them in a direction and say, go, and they'll, kind of do what you've asked them to do. But, obviously, I think his insight or, his oversight is really crucial. It can help. You've seen when, he's more focused, the results it has on the company. And I do think that, his role in government, for example, has divided his time a little bit. But it's something that you've heard in the past and has never really stopped the companies from growing. It seems a little strange that he can have such a large handful of organizations and many of them can do well, but I think his formula isn't one of necessarily micromanagement of these companies.
Yeah, I mean that really breaks the mold. VCs, if you ever really talk to them, they'll really ruffle feathers if you're not full time on something. So he certainly has broken that mold in terms of being able to have so many successful companies. The only other thing is that picture I shared, which I'm sure a lot of people have seen of his tweet schedule and that reflection on his sleep. I mean, is he just a machine that doesn't need sleep, or is there like some level of responsibilities where you think it's just like too much and he's gonna have to like get some of that time back to maintain his own sanity?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, honestly. It is a little bit concerning. I mean, I think the guy's a crazy workaholic. I've had times where I've, emailed him something at like 2:30 in the morning and he responds back a few minutes later. I mean, the guy is just, working 24/7 and he's definitely got a long list of responsibilities. So, does he need more sleep? Probably. Since he's gotten involved in X, I think he's also just tweeting more to try and keep this platform alive. It was a pretty tough deal for him. They took on a lot of debt. It was a pretty challenged situation. A lot of people thought the deal was sort of destined to fail, but he kind of just pushed through it. Now XAI's acquired them. It looks like they might find a way out of that mess. So yeah, it's it's a little crazy seeing how much his tweets have increased. But I guess that's probably been a big part of why the platform stayed alive.
Yeah, and I guess a fair question, and as we're talking about, it, is like, do you think they're all him, or do you think someone else is helping him with the account?
No, I doubt anyone's helping him with the account. Nobody else could produce, his uniquely unhinged set of tweets. I think he's all doing it himself. And I think he enjoys it. I think he's just as addicted as the rest of us, scrolling on his phone when he's in the bathroom and just shit posting like the rest of us.
No, I mean it's a good point. I feel like if I had as many followers as him, I might want to tell everybody all my thoughts too. So it's it's certainly something about the modern world. But yeah, so I actually think since I wrote this next question, kind of about valuations, there's been some interesting data. Because one of my big concerns, and I kind of even I'll give myself a little credit. The day before, I was talking about how Wall Street was, I think, under forecasting the deliveries, and that turned out to be true. But I think the bull signal there is, until the market went down overall, people reacted pretty well. The stock price reacted pretty well to those delivery announcements, which actually makes me think that while analysts might be at certain levels, hedge funds, other people kind of betting in the options markets on the institutional side, they might have actually been expecting lower. That's kind of what makes sense to me on that level. But in terms of this research I was doing, I was kind of blown away when I put it all on one table. Basically, I was looking at PEs and forward PEs for the Mag 7. And the forward P, the regular PEs are about 4 to 6 times. Tesla's about 4 to 6 times the other Mag 7 companies, and forward PEs about 3 to 5. And the craziest part about that is if you look at their sales 2 years ago from their sales last year, they had a 0.95% increase. The next biggest is Apple at 2, and after that, Amazon at about 11. And it's kind of, I don't think I've ever seen anything like that where a company is trading at so much of a multiple of PE when it's actually growing the least of the contemporaries. I think that says a lot about how the market overall feels about the long-term growth prospects of Tesla. But I guess I just have some. I have a follow-up here, but I just initially what's your concern level with especially if we do have some more of these short-term, it looks like we're gonna get a sales decline year over year. I mean, that looks highly likely with the way the deliveries came in, but maybe not as much as some people were saying. Are you concerned with, especially where the market where it is, that even if the long-term prospects are good, when the quarterly sales are announced, there could be a hit to the stock price?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, this is one of the biggest things I hear from bears that they really pound the table on. It's look at the PE ratio. Look at the trailing PE ratio on this, compare it to its peers. Hell, I mean, even one of Elon Musk's kids who hate him, I saw a video and she was saying, "Hey, the PE ratio, look at the PE ratio." I was like, okay, maybe not an expert in securities analysis, but it's definitely like a big thing people bring up. And I mean, the short and simple answer is the market's expectation is that long-term growth is going to outpace the other legacy automakers, outpace the Mag 7. And, they've been trading at a multi-hundred-billion-dollar valuation for quite some time. So somebody in the market clearly believes this. And it's interesting because when you look at the last few years, particularly if you look at the last 12 months, where people will often calculate a trailing PE, the last 12 months have not been so great. And the next 12 months aren't looking so great either. I mean, they're, reporting less profit, for example, in 2024 than they did in 2023. So I think they're facing a set of conditions right now that have depressed their earnings a little bit. So that inflates the P a little bit. But ultimately, what the market is saying here when they say, we expect Tesla to grow earnings much more than the Mag 7 or Legacy Auto is, in my sort of base case scenario, there's probably going to be many more autonomous electric vehicles in the future. And many of these legacy automakers, I mean, their sales may go to zero in sort of an autonomous future. So the P ratio you're seeing, I think, is not really a reflection of the auto business as it exists today, which, if you looked at it, you'd say, well, there's other auto companies that are actually growing sales. These guys had their sales down 1% last year. It's not really about that, but it's really a statement about a major disruption of the auto industry and how we sell cars that I think the market sees playing out long term. And the EV transition is a part of that. Despite Tesla's struggles, the EV transition has continued to accelerate around the world. I think long term, that is still something that is going to be that we see actually playing out. Maybe not as fast as people predicted, but we see it playing out. We see the technology advancing. And that's what I think the market is really betting on there. When you look at the Mag 7 companies, you look at Apple, for instance, they're falling behind in AI. They don't know what they're doing. They're struggling. You look at companies like, Facebook putting out the same product, selling ads, making billions of dollars. You don't see in the other Mag 7 companies a plan to 10x the business, right? Where's that new product line from Apple that's going to 10x the business? And Tesla is the one company I think in the Mag 7 with their investment in humanoid robotics and in self-driving cars that I think actually has a plan to do that. And I think the valuation they have sort of reflects the market's belief in that.
So here's the second part of my question, because as I look at these sales things, and I was starting to like model a little bit, and that's where I was like kind of getting my deliveries estimate. I was basically looking at the January, February reports of different countries and the prior sales and things like that. And I think as I think about the 100 upside and going kind of long, like one of the things that I struggle with is like a lot of the times I want to see the data that is supporting my thesis, right? I have the signals, but I'm just like, okay, if I can't interpret what the signal really means and why it's this way, it can be challenging to add it to my high conviction portfolio. Which, by the way, I have two portfolios and investing and trading, and Tesla's been in my for a few weeks, been in my trading one. But what is probably a hard question, but I want to see where you go with it, is I gotta think some of what's supporting that PE is, there was an announcement about, Tesla and Saudi Arabia. And then, my thesis actually, I did some like what I called the Trump trade stuff, and I had Coinbase and Tesla and some other things and took it for a nice ride before the election and after. But part of my thesis on that was I actually expected there to be some kind of announcement on full self-driving and Tesla having some kind of special privileges to test or roll things out, or robo taxis. And certainly, like I actually don't know if I've seen a story on this, but I've heard rumblings of America's desire to bring back production through robotics. And obviously, like the robotics contracts for Tesla would be huge, but I don't think those are necessarily just around the corner. So if you think about like a by the numbers way to do it, is there a way to kind of like wrap your head around quantifying those possibilities versus having them just be possibilities as you think about them?
S- Um, what do you mean quantifying the possibilities? I'm not sure I understand the question.
Like saying like, okay, I think I think Tesla could have an advantage in full self-driving, kind of a unique partnership with the American government, right? Like how would you kind of like look at what that revenue potential could be, and kind of looking at how that could affect earnings and kind of building your own forward PE that might not be in the one that Wall Street has right now?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, being best friends with the president certainly helps, as opposed to having an antagonistic federal government when you're rolling out something like autonomy or humanoid robots. But, it's really just one piece of the puzzle. Maybe it de-risks the regulatory aspect a little bit, but it's hard to quantify that. I mean, for me, I started investing when I was in the sixth grade. They said, we've got a stock picking game, and just pick some companies and we'll see the performance of all the kids. It was like a paper trading thing, and my team won. And Apple was one of the big stocks we invested in. Apple did well during that period, and I loved Apple. And I kind of realized that as somebody who was just obsessed with tech, you could often pick up a lot of growth before it happened, just seeing what people are excited about. And Tesla has been one of those products for me. I've been holding it, I think, since it was $4 a share, split adjusted. So it's been an incredible performer, and it's just, I just love the product. It's incredible. It's fun to drive, and in particular for me, since the beginning, since the first time I ever drove one, it was the autopilot, right? The idea that I have this software and I can turn it on and it can take some of the driving load off me. That I loved, and I knew it was going to be huge, bringing that to the masses. And today in the US, it's pretty much the only self-driving product you can buy and use anywhere. So, there's Waymo, but they go only certain places. A car that you can just buy and use it anywhere, they're the only ones who make it. The Tesla AI team was actually founded by two members of the OpenAI founding team, Elon Musk and Andrei Karpathy. And it's a very different kind of AI trying to get a model that runs on the device. But I think it's very overlooked, honestly. So that's kind of just where I come in at it, is just using it. I use Waymo, I use their self driving product. and I can just see what this thing is doing. It's doing pretty much every drive I need to do day to day, and it's able to do it for me now, often from my driveway to the parking spot. It'll even pull in itself. So this, I think, is going to be one of the most insane, tech trends of the next 5 years is automation. And what really, I think, sets them apart is their ability to work in the real world, to handle all kinds of situations that aren't typical, that you only see from millions and millions of miles of driving. So that's always been why I love the company and why I love using their products. And that's also the foundation of my thesis for investing in the stock as well.
You started a little earlier than me. I made my first investments in seventh grade. But yeah, I mean, I think for anyone that wants to be a long term holder of stock, like believing in the product is the most important part. Like especially if you're going to hold it for a long time. Like I think I really agree with that. It might not be the numerical analysis that would help me gain more conviction at this point. But I think so far I'm feeling better about these things. That I'm better about my concerns. It's talking to you.
Yeah, I
But
mean, I
let's
would
get
just
in.
recommend to
Oh,
people
sorry.
who
Go.
are I would just recommend to people who are curious about investing is just go on their website, schedule a test drive, and just go try the FSD in your neighborhood. It's, I think, a really important data point. A lot of people are talking about the politics or talking about Elon and all that noise. I think people have forgotten what the product actually is.
I wonder. I live near Columbus Circle in New York. I wonder if they. I wonder if I can set one up there.
Yeah, I
That
think they've got some cars to test drive in the meatpacking district.
That's an easier drive than where I am. But actually, I might give that a try as part of my diligence here. Okay, let's move on to the meaty question about robots and China. And as I looked at this, and it's just very clear. You do any research, and it's very clear that a lot of what bulls like about Tesla is Optimus. And as I'm kind of like stress testing this basic idea, I kind of looked and said, okay, last year in 2024, Tesla had a 2.3 global market share in vehicles. And, that's where, EVs are obviously, I agree with you, going to be the big thing, right? I think it's only a matter of time before they overtake, and I think I agree with you, kill some of the traditional car companies. But as I look at Tesla and say, okay, Tesla was a pioneer. They were really early to this EV game. Yet not only do they have that market share, they've also been passed by BYD, who I kind of compared the graphs in the document I sent to you. And BYD started when Tesla was already selling a lot of vehicles. They were selling, almost nothing. So that kind of scares me that they could be an early mover and kind of not be the winner on technology. Of course, there's reasons like China can beat on price because of their manufacturing and it being cheaper and everything there is totally understandable. We're challenged overall against China, I think, right now. Then you throw in the fact that BYD had that recent battery announcement. I was checking out their smart parking. That looks really cool. Is your basic thesis around this? I think I can guess based on what you said at the start that it's just like there's plenty of EVs around. Even if BYD is the ultimate winner, there'll be plenty of people that want to drive Teslas. Or do you see something that Tesla could do to kind of recapture its lead on BYD?
Yeah, I mean, BYD sells a lot of plug-in hybrids. So they're cars that actually have a gas engine. That makes up the majority of their sales. If you look at just battery electric vehicle sales, and the reason why I think it's interesting to look at just battery electric vehicles is they have a dramatically different cost structure. So if you look at just battery electric vehicles, they actually sold more than BYD in 2024, just barely, I think by a few tens of thousands of units, but they've been number one for quite some time. And when you look at the product profile, a lot of BYD's business, BYD is a very different company. They're actually kind of complementary to Tesla. and they're actually a partner of Tesla, but they make very different vehicles. So BYD makes a lot of vehicles in the commercial segment, buses. They make a lot of cars that are much cheaper than what Tesla makes. And, very sort of bare bones. Some of them we wouldn't even really consider cars by Western standards, but they also make a lot of high-end luxury cars, increasingly both hybrids and EVs. And they're a great company. They started as a battery company. They're actually a supplier to Tesla. They supply batteries for the Berlin factory. Whereas Tesla is a company that never really made batteries historically. They bought batteries from suppliers like CATL and BYD and Panasonic and LG, and they kind of put their own technology layer on top of that and sell the vehicle. So if BYD makes a better battery or someone makes a better battery, they can put that in their product. About 98% of the vehicles they sell are using, batteries from other suppliers. And they kind of put their software and their user interface on top of it, and they make it transparent to the end user, who's actually supplying the battery pack. But generally, if batteries are getting better, charging's getting faster, that is probably only going to increase EV sales. So I would say when you look at, for example, China, BYD sells many, many more vehicles than Tesla when you look at the plug-in hybrids and BEVs and all the price segments they're in. But if you look at the segments where the two compete against each other in the same sort of price point, Tesla usually actually comes up ahead. And Tesla was the number one EV in China towards the end of March there, which is pretty impressive. We're talking about the most competitive EV market in the world. So I think BYD is a great company. There's many other companies that sell more units than Tesla when you include cars that have a gas engine. Toyota, for example, does a lot of hybrids. They do, 10 million a year. BYD is incredible. They've been growing fast, but what really sets Tesla apart and what the future of Tesla is, I mean, it's almost useful at times when you're thinking about Tesla to just kind of zero out the auto business and just forget about it because they've trained this AI model that can move the car through the city on its own. That's so advanced. Others in China have called it at least a generation ahead of any other system out there. That the value of that AI model they've trained completely, dwarfs the rest of the business, and they're really focused on that while BYD's focused on, really expanding, selling a lot of hybrids and BEVs to people. Tesla's really focused on that AI model. So I think they have a lot of opportunity for growth in China as they introduce lower cost models. And BYD will do well. I mean, they'll probably continue to sell more units than Tesla at a much lower average selling price. But I think the value Tesla will be able to generate from the consumer as you look at sort of an autonomous future, most of the value is not going to be in, I think, manufacturing that car, which, if you look at the industry, I think is really becoming a commodity. I think the earnings you're going to make from manufacturing the vehicle itself are going to continue to get thinned down by competition. You're going to have all these amazing Chinese automakers competing with each other, innovating on technology, pushing the price down. I believe that side of the business is going to be commoditized long term, especially as you see the market move towards large fleet buyers who are really buying the cars and making them available for consumers to use per mile. And I think where Tesla's focusing is really going to be a big part of the value chain, the software, the network, and designing the car hardware in conjunction. So, yeah, a lot of people want to compare Tesla and BYD, but I see them as complementary in many ways. It's not necessarily about, who sold more this year, Tesla or BYD. It's really how many gas cars are sold that are manually driven versus how many autonomous electric vehicles are sold. And BYD is actually helping quite a bit. As I said, they're battery suppliers of Tesla. They work with Tesla. I mean, they're doing quite a bit to accelerate the adoption of electric vehicles around the world. I was just in Mexico, where Tesla doesn't have much presence, and I saw a BYD dealer there. They're selling into a lot of these emerging markets, South American markets, where Tesla's nowhere to be found right now because they don't have vehicles in that low price point. But the fact that that ground is being set, that infrastructure is being built, it's ultimately going to create conditions, I think, for every EV maker to thrive. So I'm not, BYD is a very different company than Tesla. They're starting to get into doing ADAS, but they're mostly focused on vehicles, on manufacturing, while Tesla's kind of taken a pivot towards AI and robotics. Yeah, they're not necessarily, I think, aiming to be a manufacturer that's going to make every type of vehicle in the world. I think licensing is going to be a big part of their business. But even if Tesla's automotive business was completely folded and they just moved to licensing, I think you could still probably justify a multi-trillion-dollar valuation. And most of that valuation, I think, is not coming from the auto business. The auto business makes up maybe, not more than $200 billion of that market cap, I think.
That's it's interesting that perspective on BYD. See, that's I feel like I learned something. As a generalist, you can't always dive that deep on these companies and the intricacies of the electric vehicle market. But just out of curiosity, like, do you think like how do you view like Waymo versus? Do you think anyone really hangs with Tesla in terms of what you're talking about in terms of the generation of their self driving?
Yeah, Waymo is obviously, I think, the world leader in driverless today. So I love Waymo. I use them all the time. And they're great because they have actually deployed a driverless service at decent scale, a few cities, and it works. It's safe. They've tested it and they've shown that they can reduce 80% of injury causing crashes. So, Waymo will forever be a pioneer in self driving cars. And Tesla didn't invent the electric vehicle either. I mean, you go back 100 years and there were companies making electric cars. You even look at General Motors, they had an electric car that they did, the EV1, which they eventually shut down. So I think what's important for companies is not necessarily being the first to do something, but to bring it mass market. Another example, Apple. There were smartphones before Apple, right? There were Blackberries and Trios and all kinds of stuff, but they took it and really brought it to the masses. And a great user interface was a key part of how they did that, marketing, etc. But with Waymo, the reason I use Tesla self-driving a lot more than Waymo is that my Tesla can take me anywhere. So the Waymo is pretty limited in where it can go. It's expensive. I have to pay for it. I have to wait a while. It often can't drop me off right where I need or pick me up right when I need. There's limitations, and most of the world doesn't have it. So, for example, if I'm going and I'm driving out to Palm Springs, Waymo won't go there. It won't leave the LA area. I'm going to have to take my Tesla. So, they've developed a technology here that is, I think, much more scalable than Waymo's solution. And Waymo's essentially burning billions of dollars keeping this rideshare service going. I'm not sure that they have a decent path to profitability. And what I've noticed from Tesla lately in the latest software is that it's actually driving more smoothly than Waymo. It's actually driving more naturally than Waymo. So they really have a tech breakthrough in their self-driving that's emerging. It hasn't quite taken that step to leapfrog Waymo yet in launching driverless, but they say that they're going to launch their service in June and it'll be going head to head with Waymo. And I think people will be able to see what I mean when I say the self driving is smoother, more comfortable, more human like. And the amazing thing is they've actually done more with less. Waymo has all these sensors sticking out of their car. They have to take a car out of a factory, move it to a remanufacturing facility, and then install all those sensors. It makes it a six-figure car. Tesla thinks that they can make a car for $25,000 that's a driverless car, and that's just going to be an ordinary car rolling off the production line. So that's the difference between Waymo having, 2,000 cars after 15 years and Tesla potentially producing millions of cars. The way I'm approaching this as an investor is self-driving is here, it works, I use it all the time. The safety benefits have been proven independently by, for example, third-party insurance companies. And there's now an urgent need to scale this technology. The safety benefits are huge. The productivity benefits are huge. We need to now replace every manually driven gas car with an autonomous electric vehicle. So, this is, I think, one of the biggest economic opportunities and one of the biggest changes to how we live since the smartphone. Computers moving around the world on their own. without needing a human to guide them necessarily or supervise them that closely. So you just, take a serious look at it. Who's going to be able to build a business doing this? Who has the cost structure to do it? And there's nobody except Tesla. I think that becomes pretty clear when you start looking into, not just the product, but the business behind it.
Yeah, I think that's I think looking at, it's kind of, I forgot the expression. I think it's like a blue ocean. I think if you're kind of looking at it that way, you can kind of see a little bit more why there's kind of this valuation beyond everything else, because while it's hard to put your finger on it, it's definitely a bullish future for full self-driving. Moving on to robot. When I'm like looking at this, and again, I'm trying to like wrap my head around numbers that maybe don't exist. But to simplify it, not around numbers, I think when I'm looking at the competition, there's tons of these companies that look like they're building really cool robots. I flagged one down the other day. That was, I think, oh yeah, it's 1X. Looks like, I guess, the Neo Gamma robot looks like a really cool one. But then you actually have like Boston Dynamics. It's been building robots forever. And my question is, how do you look at Tesla and the Optimus's ability to compete with what's going to be such a crowded market when we don't really know enough about that market yet?
Yeah, this is a great question. So, self-driving and robotics, people can see that there's an enormous market forming here. In the case of robotics, I think it's $1 trillion or multi-trillion dollar market that's emerging. In the case of self-driving, it may also be $1 trillion transportation market that they're sort of revolutionizing. And it is kind of an open question who's going to win. So you can have theories, but it's always going to be a little bit speculative at this point. And everybody and their mom is getting into humanoid robotics. People across the tech industry can see that there's a multi-trillion dollar market forming. I mean, this moment feels like if you were in, 1970 or 1980 when Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak were kind of putting computers together and everybody knew that the world was about to change, but maybe couldn't imagine just how much. That's kind of what it feels like. We're in another one of those moments where, AI is getting a body. The sort of chatbots we have are going to be able to, do pretty much anything a human can do. And there's 1X, there's Boston Dynamics, there's companies like Figure, there's companies like Unitree in China. So who's going to win the robotics market? It's an interesting question. And I would honestly be looking a lot at the Chinese companies, companies like Unitree. The Chinese companies are excellent in manufacturing. They have a manufacturing supply chain unlike anything else. So I would think they would probably be some of the top contenders in terms of scaling robotics worldwide. But I think the key for who's going to win robotics is who's going to make the brain, because we've been able to make robots for quite some time. I mean, you can even go back a few decades and see Honda Asimo or Boston Dynamics Atlas or a number of humanoid robots that were pretty impressive. But they didn't have a brain to tell them what to do. They often needed a human to control them, or they needed to have a routine that was pre-programmed. So the big thing is who can make the brain. And the reason why this has been getting so much attention lately is essentially because of ChatGPT and the rise of LLMs. For the first time, we can see that we have this technology that could maybe create a robot brain that was decently intelligent. So that's going to be the real breakthrough, is who can train that model or create that software that's going to be that brain that makes the robot hardware useful, right? Because if I've got a robot and it can't do much, it slips when it walks up the stairs, it, breaks my windows and breaks my glasses and my laundry shrinks or, tears when it does it, then that robot's not going to be very useful. I'm not going to ask it to do anything. If you have a robot that's deeply intelligent, that understands context, that understands, all the background knowledge that LLMs have, and is able to move the robot accurately, safely, you feel comfortable having it in your house, it's not going to destroy everything, that's the company that's going to win. And in terms of who actually knows how to create a robot brain like that, there are very few companies that have actually demonstrated competence in this more than Tesla. As I said, they're the only ones with a self-driving car you can actually buy and just tell it to take you around. And that works when it's raining, when it's sunny, when it's night, just the range of different scenarios they've had to train it for. That's kind of what you need to do to get it to work in the real world. And that's why I think they're probably going to be one of the leading companies in robotics. They know how to make the brain, but they've also got manufacturing knowledge. They've got factories on 4 continents. And, I agree, it is too early to say for sure who's going to win. I would probably give Optimus a minimal value or discount its potential severely because there is quite a lot of execution risk. You don't know. It's quite speculative. But it's one of those speculative bets that if it plays out, it becomes more valuable than the entire company. So if you make enough bets like that and a few of them pay off, that's how you're continually 10xing the company. And that's why I love investing in Tesla, right? An ordinary CEO would have said, you know what, let's expand the product line. Let's do a bigger SUV. Let's do a van. Let's do, a different type of vehicle. And they'd probably grow earnings a little bit, expanding the product line. But Elon's always thinking about, okay, what can we actually do to 10x this business? Not just add a few more cars, but take this AI model we've trained for the cars and allow it to automate not just driving, but anything. So, yeah, everyone and their mom is doing a robot. I think Meta is interested. I think Apple is interested. We're going to see probably a lot more entrants to this market who we don't even know yet. But I think Tesla is going to be a serious contender just because of what they're doing with self-driving, what they're doing with manufacturing, and just the team is absolutely relentless. So yeah, that one I think is a little more of a question mark, but it's one of those things when you are trying to figure out what multiple should I assign this. It's one of the things that is in a bullish case going to be one of the biggest drivers of growth, and it sort of makes sense if you've got this model that can do all my driving and it's driving me around all day. Well, if it can drive me around Los Angeles safely without killing me, and you have all these crazy people around, well, yeah, why can't it pick up my laundry or do my dishes or babysit my kids?
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, people like you that have been in Tesla forever, they've seen this story before. There was a lot of people doubting that he was going to be as successful with EVs like this, and actually one of the things that kind of always impressed me, especially as I was starting to really become a Tesla bull in 2023, was what he negotiated with the direct sales of Teslas to people. I mean, the car lobby had been such a block to that for such a long time. Yet he solved that. So that's one thing that you really have to give Elon Musk credit for. He cuts through, red tape that if you look at it, you didn't even know that was red tape that could be cut sometimes. So you do have to give him credit with that. And yeah, I mean, the robot market is gonna be so interesting. And I do like the stuff coming out of China. I was actually at CES this year. Um, and I saw this crazy like autonomous vehicle that had like a drone that came out of the back. I think it was, I don't know, I think the company's pronounced XEPNG. And I don't know how to say that. um, but yeah, it's gonna be fun. It's gonna be fun to watch. And I mean, when I look at that market, I think there's gonna be tons of winners because the fact of the matter is, if you look at things like fast food and what kind of robot is going to be successful at that, that's very different than the kind of robot that's going to be successful with like chores in your home. And you can think of a number of other applications. So I think that'll be an interesting thing to watch with the market. Is it something that someone will just build a multi-purpose bot that can do everything better than a lot of other bots, or will we see kind of specialization there? But let's move on to insider sales. Because that was actually one of the things that had me taking a deeper dive because and having some of these conversations online that made me want to dig into some other assumptions because I was seeing a lot of people make a big deal online about the insider sales of Tesla. And until I really dig into the numbers myself, I'm not one to be like, oh well, Tesla's having big insider sales, or I really want to be able to comment and benchmark. And when I dug in, I did see something that that's showing basically Tesla insiders are accelerating their sales. And what I put together is I put together a graph of the Mag 7 at insider sales the last 12 months and then one the last 3 months. And what I actually observed is Tesla was accelerating in the last 3 months to the tune of basically of the last 12 months total in the last 3 months, 68.5% of their sales have happened in basically the trailing quarter. The next highest was Meta at 38%, and then Google was at zero because there haven't been any buys and sells of Google. So I do look at that and say, well, accelerating insider sales does make me a little nervous. And I would actually say more specifically, when I talked to some people, interacted with them about this, a lot of people kind of said, well, at that valuation or at where Tesla's valued, like these insiders have to take profits. And as I kind of thought more about that, I was like, well, I'm not sure that's the good argument that you think it is. Because in saying that they have to take profits, you're also kind of admitting, and I saw people mention the PE, like you're also kind of admitting that the insiders might think that the company is overvalued. Does that concern you at all?
Yeah, this is another really interesting point. So, generally, I think insider sales are something that you should pay close attention to, right? I mean, if things are going well, you tend to say, well, let's wait and sell the stock a little bit later. So, I do think it's predictive. There is an element of sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy to it, too. You can look at, for example, some of the sales Elon made, where he said, hey, I'm selling for this reason or that reason, I'm going to pay taxes or whatever. And you can see the stock's performance after that. So there definitely is some signal there. At the same time, I mean, they've been dealing with this case that has just rocked the legal world, which is the Tornetta case, where an investor sued over Elon Musk's compensation package. And, they had this compensation package from 2018 revoked. This has resulted in Tesla leaving Delaware and other companies leaving Delaware. And, more recently, they've actually even seen Delaware make some changes to their law to try and keep some of their, corporations from leaving. So it's caused a big uproar. And one of the sort of foundational elements of the Tornetta case was that, and I'm not a legal scholar, so I'm probably going to butcher this a little bit, but one of the sort of foundational ideas was that the approval of the compensation package was not valid because the board was effectively controlled by Musk. And a big part of why they cited many of the board members were controlled is that they were paid heavily through equity for their board role. So they're granted equity, either incentive stock options or RSOs, and they said they're too concentrated in Tesla. They can't necessarily afford to lose Elon, or they're too beholden to him because of some of their equity holdings. And I think as a result of that, as they've been going through the appeal for this case, they've just been exercising and selling any additional option grants. And I think there was some disclosure about this. So, do you want to completely disregard the signal? No, I think it is an important signal to look at. And I mean, you look at the quarterly numbers reported yesterday. I think you can kind of see why they might want to sell. Some of these are on like 10b5-1 plans, and they're planned. Some of it is them sensing what's going on, but there is also the backdrop of this legal case that I think has been responsible for a greater number of insider sales recently.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's a it's kind of refreshing to hear because and I think for Tesla shareholders that go and talk about the company, I think that's such an important thing to do, what Omar just did, where like some of what I was seeing was people basically like denying that the sales actually were declining or this and that or and nobody really talked about the lawsuit, but it's so important if you're conveying something because where I'm at from the start is that I'm a little worried in the short term, but less worried in the long term, especially with what Prospero signals are saying. So I think if you're going to go evangelize a stock, it's so important to be able to say, like, I think they could see the numbers. I think they would want to take some profits. And that's a reasonable human thing to say. There might be a tough quarter or two ahead and they want to take profits, but they still believe in the long-term story. I think then you might have a lot more people that are looking long-term, and instead of focusing on, hey, the short-term story is scary and the sales are declining or whatever, instead you can kind of turn them more around to saying, well, actually the long-term story is good, and maybe the market's always ahead, and maybe we're done with this sell-off and people should start thinking about the long story more again. So I think, if you're off and talking to someone like me that wants to have a reasonable discourse about insider sales, I just think if you just disregard it, and even downplay, some of these sales problems that they're seeing in the short term, it might not be effective as kind of, answering it the way Omar did, which I think is a good answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a reason people focus on insider sales, and it's because there really is some signal there. When you believe that the stock is about to shoot up, you tend to not want to sell, right? So there is some signal there. I think it's important to be realistic. At the same time, when you see these Form 4s from Robin Denholm or someone else, I would look at the amount of securities still owned besides the transaction. And these directors all have pretty significant stakes in Tesla, which I think probably, signals their long-term belief. If they didn't believe, they'd probably be trying to dispose of the shares much more quickly.
Yeah, I was actually just looking up because I didn't know, but I didn't have the time. I don't know if you know the percent owned by insiders, because that's always a good thing to look at too. The total percentage of shares outstanding owned by insiders, that's always a good barometer. Because if you're
Yeah,
just
I'm not
looking
sure
at,
off the top of my head. What is it?
yeah, I was gonna look it up, and it's I'm always benchmarking that too, because it's so important versus the sales. If you're just like, oh, they still own, like, generally like 10% of the company is good. I start to get concerned under like 2%. Where is this gonna be on Yahoo Finance? Holders, there we go. Okay, yeah, there we go. Still 12.89% held by insiders. So that's always, that's above the number that I said is a good number. And I said it before I looked. So yeah, I think that's always an important thing to keep in perspective. For me, it wasn't the sales as much as the acceleration. So I'm going to keep my eye on that, because, if we basically see, this quarter another step up, that could be a little more bearish. But if we kind of see this as like a 1 quarter blip, where it might be they're getting ahead of these like headlines and these sales declines, they certainly own enough of it in aggregate, that I think more data, it looks at like more data is warranted before you sell on this basis alone.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting one to take a look at, as well as any insider buys that may happen.
Yeah. All right. So we're coming to the last question, and we touched on it a little bit, but it's kind of a combination of a few of the stories. So, I actually really like Tesla's approach from a business standpoint to do camera only. Just because, a lot of that other equipment is so expensive. I think that's a big reason, why Waymo, it doesn't, is going to produce less units. But especially with this public backlash, I'm a little nervous, because as I look at self-driving cars, like, what I always say from a high level is that people are going to get hurt by self-driving cars. There's going to be accidents, property, like, it's growing pains. Like, if you've been around machine learning models or AI models for long enough to know, like, there's always growing pains. So, originally, when I was like looking at this, I was just like, well, if there's growing pains for Tesla or whoever, it doesn't really matter, because it'll be all around. But now I'm a little worried with the backlash against Elon Musk. If, Teslas have at all a higher rate of accidents, if, I'm not as concerned in America, but if in other countries it could be a problem for the sales and rollout of such a high margin product. And when I was reading about this, basically the lidar systems, it does seem like they have some problems in fog and rain, as well as some of the roads in China seem to be better with lidar um, than the camera based technology. Are you concerned about, like, and I would say most specifically the potential combination of this backlash Elon is facing, along with cameras that might have more difficult edge cases, potentially creating less patience from the public around those products?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think really in terms of politics, regulators have said, look, we want to regulate based on technology performance. We're not going to legislate engineering solutions. We're not going to say you have to use LiDAR, you have to use camera. Just come up with the best system you can use. And we're going to measure the performance of that system. And it's my belief that the camera based systems are actually going to be able to outperform many of the LiDAR based systems on performance and safety, which is pretty counterintuitive to a lot of people. But the key for self driving, I think, is really deep learning. So, what a LiDAR does is it shoots a laser out, and they usually have it spin. So, it shoots a laser out in a circle and it measures the time it takes for that laser to come back. And that'll tell you really accurately how far away everything is around you, which is really useful for self-driving. And you can then build a map, an HD map. You can go scan the city, and then you can go compare that with the LiDAR scan, and you can localize yourself. You can find out where your car is on the map with centimeter level accuracy, whereas GPS is much less accurate. So you know what's around you, you know sort of where you are on the map. But in many ways, this has been kind of a crutch of sorts for not having the intelligence to actually, understand the scene as we can see it. And with today's deep learning systems, they're able to, just using cameras, drive around and not require any LiDAR at all. Because what they actually do is, the funny thing is, Tesla is actually the number one customer of one of the LiDAR companies, Luminar. But what they do is, instead of putting the LiDAR in their cars that they sell to you, they put it in their test cars, gather data, and build a model that can actually give you the output of the LiDAR, or at least something quite similar, using just the cameras. So essentially, you have what the LiDAR gives you at a fraction of the cost using just cameras. So the deep learning approach, I think, is really key here. Originally, we thought that self driving was about measuring what's around you. Okay, I can see there's a pedestrian there, and he's 5 feet away, and he's moving at this speed. So we thought it was really about seeing where that pedestrian is. But as we kind of moved along in development, I think we found that it's not even about seeing what's in front of you right now, but actually about being able to predict the future and what's going to happen in 5 seconds. Okay, there's a pedestrian there, but is he going to walk into the street? Is he going to stand still? Is he going to walk backwards? What's he going to do? And how do I have to prepare for that? And the camera can find the pedestrian's position just as well as the LiDAR. But what deep learning is really good at is predicting the future in that way. And the formula for building these models that can predict what other agents are going to do in the scene is take a large data set, take a lot of compute, and train this model, show it tons of driving data, and it's then going to be able to predict what other people can do. So, more than just knowing their position, can you tell me their position in 5 seconds based on what you think is likely? Oh, okay, they have a blinker. They're probably getting into the left turn lane. We can start to speed up a little bit. And that kind of thing actually ends up being, I think, much more important for smooth self driving than just having an accurate position of everything that's around you. The lidar can tell me that person is there, but it's not going to tell me, information like, for example, if I see that the guy's on his phone and he's not paying attention, or I see that he's looking both ways in the way that you might before you cross the street. All of these little sort of signals are in the visual spectrum. So if you think about how we drive, there's no lasers. There's been a lot of sort of propaganda by these lidar companies to tell you, no, you need these lasers on your car. You're not going to be safe without it. But just logically, we know that we only drive using information in the visual spectrum.
everything we use to make decisions is all there. And anything that, blocks out the visual spectrum, for example, fog or rain or whatever, if you can see out the windshield and understand what's going on enough to drive, then the camera can also see what you're seeing and pick up on the same information. So I think a lot of people are now moving towards vision. You saw Xpeng, for example, and others. You've got companies like Wave and Comma that are pursuing a vision only solution. It's still kind of controversial. You saw some YouTube videos about this. They did a Looney Tunes wall test and they said Tesla couldn't see it, but then someone else retested it with FSD. It turned out it could see it. So this is a big debate that's ongoing even today, but I'm pretty convinced by what I'm seeing that vision-based self-driving is going to win. And that's because it works much better with deep learning. Because these cameras are cheaper, it's much easier to build a large data set and it's much simpler to build a great deep learning model that operates on vision. And when you have some of these other systems, because you need all these additional sensors, the scale is limited and that actually, prohibits you from building that large data set and that huge model. Finally, I think, vision is necessary and sufficient for driving, which is to say that if everything else on the car fails, right? Because things break sometimes. And when you're on a self driving car, you need to think of that. Let's say a rock hits the LiDAR, or somehow it gets unplugged and loses power, or something like that. You can't drive without vision. So if you just have a LiDAR, you can't read traffic lights, you can't read a lot of road markings. You need the cameras to work. And you want the system to work even if everything else fails. So even if the LiDAR fails, you should have a vision system that's strong enough to drive the car, even if that breaks. And you can, I think, add on other layers on top of that. Long story short, I think focusing on vision not only allows you to train better AI, but it allows you to scale to millions of cars. And when we talk about the service that's really going to win, it's going to be who can provide the lowest cost service that has the most cars so that when I call a car, there's one that's just a few minutes away and can really scale to be able to, take over the market. So, yeah, this is still a little bit of a debated topic. As of today, there are no pure vision self-driving cars that are driverless. There's only Waymo, which is using lidar, and other companies that are using lidar. But in June, we're going to have our first pure vision self-driving service. And actually, Waymo and Tesla are both going to be operating in Austin. So we'll be able to compare them head to head. We'll be able to compare the crash rates. And I think people are going to be surprised long term to see that pure vision systems actually beat a lot of the best LiDAR systems we have today in every metric, including safety.
I definitely see the argument for that. And it's, I mean, I actually, I saw that, that Wile E. Coyote thing, but I didn't see the debunking of it. But I guess, part of thought exercise is like, let's say the crash rates are higher for Tesla than Waymo. Do you think that becomes like a news problem for them?
Yeah, of course. I think it's going to be scrutinized very closely, and people are going to compare the crash rates. They're going to compare them to human drivers. They're going to compare them to other self-driving cars. So they do need to show, very strong performance. I mean, I think maybe, a few accidents can be forgiven. If it's a sustained thing, if somebody gets seriously hurt, if somebody gets killed, of course, the public's going to be very upset. And it's going to have 10 times the scrutiny of the human driven crashes that happen every day. So they need to really be excellent. They need to beat everything else out there. And if they don't, then yes, people will absolutely question the wisdom of developing a pure vision self-driving solution. But I think everybody will be surprised based on what I'm seeing. I'm actually seeing their model leapfrog systems like Waymo. And it's not just me, other guests, passengers, friends of mine, they notice, yeah, this thing is a little more jerky. It's hitting the brakes a little harder. It's not as comfortable as the Pure Vision system. And I think as they train bigger models, they're going to continue to leapfrog them. So it's difficult to say at this point. We don't have any data we can point to and say, look, it is actually performing just as well in terms of the number of crashes as Waymo. But in a few months, I think we are going to start to see that data come in. And you know, I'd say it's certainly a risk for Tesla, right? They've made this big bet on pure vision. But I think they're going to surprise people, honestly. And I think most of all, both Waymo and Tesla are going to blow human drivers out of the water. You know, you've seen 80% of injury causing crashes reduced with Waymo. I think that's going to continue to improve. I think both Waymo and Tesla will be able to reduce more than 90% of injury causing crashes. And, you know, they have this saying, the best camera is the one you have with you. The best self-driving AI is the one you have with you when you need it to save your life. So when you're in that moment and you have a car and you're about to hit somebody or you're about to get into a crash with another car, that AI being there and being on your car, which is really what Pure Vision is great at. It's low cost enough to be included in every car. That's what matters more than anything. So even if you had a system that was, I think, maybe even a little better, and but it was limited, it could only be in a few thousand cars. You're probably going to save a lot more lives with the system that's simpler and does a pretty good job of stopping crashes.
Yeah, I mean, we're in pure agreement that the strategy that scales is the right one. Like long term. You definitely, the more training data you have, more cars on the road, the more diversity to that, that's going to be how you win. But it's kind of the overall theme in the in the conversation. A lot of the risks that we're highlighting are short term risks, and the long term picture looks a lot cleaner, I would say.
Yeah, yeah, and I think when you look at the long term of computer vision, I mean, it's just incredible. If you show an image to ChatGPT or Grok and you ask it questions, it's really able to understand that image now. So I think computer vision is really going to shock people long term. Short term, I think you hit the nail on the head that it's one of the major tech risks in this story, right? And you can say I believe it or I don't believe it, but the proof is really in the pudding. Also, Meta, he's here on stage. He's an engineer at, a tech company. I was wondering if he had any thoughts on the subject.
Yeah, I tagged you in a couple of these things, Prospero, on the LiDAR discussion specifically. If you look through the numbers and you just look at it from a reaction time standpoint, LiDAR is going to get you at best at parity with an F1 driver, whereas camera only, or there are some arguments for 4D radar, can get you to 4 to 10 times better than 4 to 8 times better than a F1 driver. So reaction time obviously matters a lot in driving and safety. So when you think of the reaction time, you can also think of trading that off for being a little smarter, thinking a little bit longer. So ultimately, for all things considered, there isn't a lot of data that is substantiating that LiDAR will be safer in the long term. Even with fog, I typed in an IEEE study that shows LiDAR really doesn't make a difference. It almost is within the error band of how much LiDAR and camera compares to camera alone. And LiDAR on its own is obviously just doesn't work. So there's a lot of discussion around LiDAR and the value of LiDAR, but I don't know if it actually is material in reality.
Yeah, and we'll have to see ultimately how it actually plays out in the market, but it does seem like there's this problem of too many lidar companies that were started. And there was a time when these companies were started that people believed every car would have lidar in it. So they said, okay, there's demand for maybe 80 million units. And you look at the way the market's shaped out, self-driving cars have taken a little longer to play out than many of these companies had hoped, and you're not really seeing a desire by many of these automakers to include it. They're really kind of concentrated among a few vendors. So you've got kind of too many companies chasing very few customers who are probably only going to pick one vendor. So a lot of these lidar companies are probably in trouble. Some of the better ones will probably stay around, but there's a lot of that, I think, framing the discussion. These companies are arguing for their lives that, well, hey, you need us. You can't do this without us. Um, but that may or may not be true. And I think the market will do a good job of deciding whether it is.
Yeah, I actually had a quick question. I mean, you brought it up, Omar, but like just for discussion, mentioning the deep learning being optimized for camera, like that's not something I'm completely wrapping my head around because I feel like the lidar systems could also be predictive and they could also use deep. I mean, maybe the data size is larger, and that's the issue for processing times. But yeah, I don't know if someone wants to tackle that because that's kind of like my remaining question.
Yeah, I think for for cameras, these things cost like $5, right? So you can afford to put it in every car. As a matter of fact, all major car manufacturers put cameras on their car. You buy a new Mercedes, a Tesla, whatever, it's going to have cameras all over the car. And because of that, you can have a fleet of 7 million plus cars like Tesla has that are collecting data. Whereas with LiDAR, because of the cost of the car, you're usually only going to have it on higher end units. It's going to be more difficult to build up as extensive as a data set that have that kind of needle in a haystack scenario, that rare unexpected scenario, which is unusual, but where the system still needs to work. So it's really the ubiquity of cameras that make it much simpler to build a large data set. And, you know, when you're just looking at an image, I can just open that image up on my computer and I can look at it. I can understand it. A LiDAR point cloud, which is kind of a bunch of 3D clouds, it's a lot more difficult for the human to even understand. So there's just a lot of simplicity you gain from focusing on one ubiquitous sort of modality for training. Meta, maybe you have some more thoughts on that.
Yeah, to answer your question around like there's more data, if you hold the compute in the vehicle constant, which obviously you're going to put the most advanced computer for the hardware, for the space, for the power that you can into the vehicle. After that's done, think of like LiDAR. You have to allocate a pixel for every single unit of distance where camera's giving you color, right? So you've increased the total input size. And as we see with models like DeepSeek and others, where thinking models perform better than non-thinking models, you can imagine that kind of also plays out for things like FSD, where instead of allocating that time to shorter thinking with more input, you're better off giving it longer time to think with less input, and the reaction time remains constant. So it also ultimately always just comes down to the reaction time. Would you rather a little bit more time to process the image or the pixels coming in from the image? Or would you rather have even more images of the same scene and have it process each of those for less time? And data is suggesting that you want to go with deeper models versus shallower, more informed models.
Thanks. That makes a lot of sense.
Okay, well, is there anything else or we through your questions?
No, yeah, we went through them. This was great. Thanks a lot for accepting my request. I feel like I learned a lot. I hope other people did too. And yeah, this was awesome.
Yeah, it was really fun discussion. I think it's always really important if you're investing seriously to consider both bear perspectives. And by the way, if you don't have Prospero, go download it from the App Store. It's free. This is an app that I use every day. They have a lot of just really great signals. You can browse through, get stock ideas, short-term bull picks, long-term, short-term bear picks, long-term bear picks. You can look up any stock like Tesla and look at some of these signals. There's really nothing to lose. It's a pretty great app. So go ahead and download it. And I think you'll probably find some value in it like I did.
Yeah, and if you do find yourself in there, I will say what I'm looking for on like Tesla for my high conviction pick. I'm looking for it like the last like run that it had and kind of like March 21st. It looks like net option sentiment was in the low 90s, high 80s. So that's the range I'm going to be looking for to like say, okay, I think these like short term problems have been, kind of the market's more confident about them. They've been resolved a lot. And, for someone, I mean, some people might say to that, like, oh, I own Tesla. I always own Tesla. What I've found people that are, pretty like bullish on a stock overall. A lot of people I think can use it for sizing. So you might want to think about sizing up when you see it in that like net options in like that 90 or above range and where it is down at 60 now. You might want to just think about your sizing for that. That's what I think. Like kind of people that are like perpetually bullish on a stock, they kind of find what I would call that kind of like enhanced dollar cost averaging strategy useful.
Yeah, that's a really great tip. And yeah, I mean,
both bulls and bears just love Tesla because it's the craziest stock. I mean, you look at yesterday, horrible delivery numbers, stock shoots up, president gives a speech, market tanks. You never know what's going to happen. And, there's so much volatility. It's great for both bulls and bears. So, thanks so much, Prospero and Meta. This was a really great discussion. I enjoyed it. Go check out the Prospero app, and yeah, maybe we can do some more discussions like this about other stocks sometimes. Um, really appreciate you taking the time to be here. It was great.
Yeah,
But
happy to.
a, bi-
Anytime, Omar. Thanks.
a big shout out to both of you for having a very civil discussion and showing folks how you can have very educated and informed discussions from opposing sides.
Yeah,
Yeah,
isn't it nice when people just discuss the points and the facts?
yeah, I think it's really important to be able to do as an investor. All right, take care, everyone. Thanks you all for being here. Go check out Prospero in the App Store.
Thanks.